It's a real pleasure to introduce our speaker this evening, Dr. Joseph Wong, and the subject of his talk. Why have some autocratic regimes fully embraced democratic politics in Asia, while others experience more checkered histories or simply resist? There are many paths, as we know, and many factors that lead to democracy around the world. Since the 1970s, though, conventional wisdom often presumes that dictatorships, whether run by military generals, single-party states, reactionary strongmen, embrace regime change when they are weak. Mounting opposition on the streets, economic crisis, perhaps defeat in war, undermine their political legitimacy and trigger their demise. Similarly, we frequently assume that the main political actors in these important historic events are progressive, liberal elites, urban middle classes, and especially workers and left-wing parties. And finally, we often believe that rapid economic growth, industrialization, and urbanization fosters deep social transformations in class structures and political values that will eventually encourage greater popular support for democratization. Our guest this evening has just published a terrific new book that joins a growing body of academic scholarship that challenges these conventional views. Joseph Wong is the Roz and Ralph Halbert Professor of Innovation at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Vice President International at the University of Toronto. Widely recognized for his scholarship on public policy, the political economy of development, and globalization in East Asia, Dr. Wong is the author of two earlier books, Healthy Democracies, Welfare Politics in Taiwan and Korea, published in 2006, and Betting on Biotech, Innovation and the Limits of Asia's Developmental State, published in 2011. He's also co-edited several important volumes, including Political Transitions in Dominant Party Systems and Innovating for the Global South towards an Inclusive Innovation Agenda. An award-winning teacher, his scholarship also informs many public initiatives, including a fascinating collaborative project called the REACH Alliance, which examines how governments, civic organizations, and communities can deliver by working together essential services to marginalized citizens living in extreme poverty in different regions of the world. The subject of Joe's talk this evening is his latest book, co-authored with Dan Slater from the University of Michigan, titled, as you see, From Development to Democracy, The Transformations of Modern Asia. One of the most dramatic changes in the world economy over the last 50 years is the spectacular modernization of many countries along the Pacific Rim in Asia beyond the Indian subcontinent. Yet the range of political regimes in this region is wide. Today, Japan, Taiwan, and South Korea are robust democracies. Countries such as Indonesia, Myanmar, and Thailand, however, have experienced more checkered records. And a number of polities either resist democratic reforms, most notably Singapore, or remain powerful autocracies, from Cambodia and Vietnam to the most significant of all, China. So what explains this pattern of democracy and dictatorship in the so-called developmental states of Asia? And what lessons might we, and those who rule these countries, learn from history? Joe will speak for about 30 minutes. He and I will then begin a conversation about some of the themes and arguments of his book before we open it up to questions and comments from you. Please join me in welcoming Joseph Wong.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Sanjay, for that really kind introduction and really a terrific introductory lecture to Political Science 101 and modernization theory, which I'll talk a little bit about in my own comments. Let me begin by thanking our hosts at the other great university in the city of Toronto, TMU, for putting on this really spectacular series. Sanjay and I had an opportunity to chat a little bit before, and I wanted to probe a little bit about how the front lines of democracy emerged as the theme for this speaker series and how he was able to revive this real salon type of experience that we're all having here tonight. And it's really the vision of not only the chair that Sanjay possesses, but also his visionary scholarship that allows us to have this conversation tonight. I also want to thank our hosts at the Toronto Public Library. I think this is really incredible. When the invitation came over the transom, I was just so excited because the Toronto Public Library is one of our real public squares. It's a place where we have intellectual conversations, where we can exchange ideas, where we can have a kind of civic discourse that is unfortunately lacking in so many parts of the world now. And so it's entirely appropriate that we have a lecture series and a seminar series on the front lines of democracy at the very front line of democracy. I also just want to acknowledge my co-author, Dan Slater, who's unable to join us because he was just giving a talk on this book at the University of British Columbia yesterday. But I do want to acknowledge just his, the extraordinary partnership that we've been able to develop over the last 10 years as we wrote this book. This book was a 10-year journey. And apropos of that, I also want to extend my gratitude to Princeton University Press for their patience as they waited for this book manuscript to be finished, because indeed the book manuscript was 5 years late. So to all of my friends in the audience who wonder if I have a job or I do anything at my job, I'll let you continue to wonder. But actually, the timing couldn't be better, because if the book had come out 5 years earlier, Aung San Suu Kyi would still be the democratically elected leader of Myanmar, and Xi Jinping would be an enigma, and many observers around the world at the time were wondering if perhaps Xi was consolidating political power to perhaps unleash a liberalization of the Chinese political system. Of course, we know that's not the case now, and so publishing this book now allows us the benefit of that near-term hindsight. But I think even more importantly, the stakes of this debate between autocracy and democracy could not be any more dire, and the stakes could not be any greater than they are today, as the showdown between autocracy and democracy looms ever larger, as democracies demonstrate their fragility almost on a daily basis, and the specter of autocracy continues to confound global order as well as our very theories of development and democracy. Indeed, as we look around in the news these days, the opinion pages and the news are replete with stories about political instability in China. We have observers who are looking for the seeds of the collapse of the Chinese Communist Party regime in China as a harbinger of democratic reform to come. The stakes couldn't be higher, because what we're looking for is for democracy to emerge from the ashes of a collapsed regime, which would be calamitous to humanity and, of course, to the 1.4 billion people living in China. So how did this book begin? I was mentioning that it took us 10 years to write it, but it actually begins with an experience I had in 2000. In 2000, I was a finishing PhD student. I was just about to start my job at U of T as an assistant professor, and I had the opportunity to be a part of an election observer team. And I have since participated in these observations in Taiwan over the last 22 years. And in 2000, I was part of an election observer team, and I happened to be with my doctoral advisor, Professor Edward Friedman at the time, who was a fierce champion of democracy, who had been blacklisted by the autocratic regime in Taiwan for decades. And we were at the election in 2000, and it was the election night in which, for the first time, an opposition candidate, Chen Shui-bian, won the election, and won the election peacefully, and was about to assume political power. And I remember being at the rally, and these rallies in Taiwan are raucous events. It's really quite crazy. It's a lot of fun. And President-elect Chen Shui-bian was being escorted onto the stage, and I looked to my advisor, and he had a tear in his eye. I said, "Ed, why are you crying?" And he said, it's not, the irony that the security apparatus that had once jailed and imprisoned this political activist was now securing him as he made his ascent to the presidency. And this was significant because what we see here is actually democracy emerging not from the ashes of a collapsed regime, but actually an autocratic regime that had conceded democracy. It's the same autocratic regime that had jailed these political prisoners that were now safeguarding their passage to the presidency. In 1986, in Taiwan, a group of activists, opposition activists, formed illegally at the time the opposition party, the Democratic Progressive Party, or the DPP. And it was illegal at the time because Taiwan was still under martial law at that time. And all of the observers of Taiwanese politics and Asian politics just assumed that this autocratic regime, which was by every measure one of the most autocratic regimes imaginable, everyone assumed that this autocratic regime would simply crush and clamp down on the formation of this political party. But it didn't. And indeed, in 1987, this regime lifted martial law. In 1992, we see supplementary elections. In 1996, we see founding presidential elections, and it takes us to 2000, where we see the first turnover and peaceful turnover of political power. This was remarkable not only for the personal anecdote that I shared, it was remarkable because this was a regime that was not on the verge of collapse. This was a strong autocratic regime. Taiwan's economy was booming at the time. It was not in a moment of economic crisis. In other words, it was a strong political economic regime that conceded democracy, and conceded democracy not on the verge of collapse, but rather when the regime was strong. And so the question we end the book with is, can we imagine the Chinese Communist Party conceding democracy in this way? Can we imagine a strong CCP conceding democracy in precisely this way? So this book, as Sanjay has already nicely prefaced, is in some ways an ode to modernization theory. And so if any of you have taken Political Science 101, you'll know what I'm talking about here. And modernization theory is a long-standing theoretical tradition in the social sciences, which contends that development and the transformation that comes with development, the social, the political, and the economic transformation that comes from development, leads to democratic transition. And indeed, this book is a book that chronicles the process of development in Asia. Indeed, the very first paragraph of the book reads following: "Economic development is Asia's inescapable fact. Imagine a seasoned Asia traveler from the early 1970s being catapulted 50 years forward in time to any Asian city in the present day. Whether they touched ground in Tokyo, Seoul, Hong Kong, Singapore, Shanghai, Taipei, or even Hanoi, Jakarta, Bangkok, or Kuala Lumpur, there is simply no question what transformation would strike them first. One of the world's poorest regions has become one of its richest." So in many regards, this book is a book about development. It's a book about industrial policy. It's a book about agricultural reform. It's a book about science and technology development. And it's a book that chronicles the deeply historical processes that undergird the transformation that we see in Asia, and the structural transformation that we see in Asia, whether it be in terms of how socioeconomic class emerges, or how we see an increasingly urban and literate middle class emerge. But of course, structures don't choose democracy. People choose democracy. So just as this book is a book about economic and social development in the Asia region, it is also a book about Suharto. It's also a book about Thailand's Thaksin. It's a book about South Korea's No Tae-woo, Taiwan's Jiang Jingguo, and indeed China's Xi Jinping. The main argument in the book is that in Asia, stable democratic transformation has not emerged from the ashes of a collapsed regime, but rather the modal pathway for democratic transformation and stable democratic transformation in Asia is a process that Dan and I call democracy through strength. And this is the paradox that we exploit in the book, because these regimes are precisely those regimes that are strong enough to resist democratization, as we have seen, but also have the strength to concede democracy and to concede stable democracy. The book begins with two contrasting narratives, and it's done in a very narrative style, in a very sort of accessible way. And the first story we tell is the story of the Philippines, which is a classic example of what we describe as democracy through weakness. This is a story of collapsism. This is a story of the Marcos regime that collapses under the weight of its own illegitimacy. It's a regime in which the autocratic leader has to flee the country because his legitimacy had run its course. This is the classic case of what we refer to as democracy through weakness, and indeed, the rocky shoals of democratic transformation in the Philippines has suggested this has been far from the kind of stable democratic transition that we would optimally like to see. We contrast this with the classic story of democracy through strength. And here's a picture of No Tae-woo, who is now being sworn in as president. He's a general. And he's a general that was affiliated and associated, and in fact, one of the leading political lieutenants of the prior military autocratic regime in South Korea. But it was a regime that in the summer of 1987, in the face of continual protests, concedes democratic reform, concedes democratic elections in December of 1987, and full and free presidential elections in the spring of 1988. So what we share at the very beginning of the book, which we hope brings the reader in, are two contrasting stories of how authoritarianism ends and how democracy might emerge. One is a story in which the autocratic regime ends through collapse and calamity, and another story in which authoritarianism ends when the incumbent authoritarian regime concedes democracy and becomes a democratic regime and contests democratic elections thereafter. The book ends with then a contemplation of China. Should we be contemplating a democratic future for China that emerges with the collapse of the Chinese Communist Party regime? Or can we imagine a democratic future in China in which it adheres to a pattern of democracy through strength? And the argument we make at the end of the book, for normative reasons, is that we should hope for a democracy through strength scenario because this tends to lead to more stable democratic transitions. And as I've already intimated, for very humanitarian reasons, we should also hope for a democracy through strength scenario because this is one in which we can avoid the humanitarian calamities that would come with such a collapse. The implications of this are not trivial, however, because then when we think about democracy promotion around the world, and when we indeed think about democracy promotion in China, demonizing the regime does no good. Rather, what is essential is demonstrating to the autocratic regime that democracy and development can go hand in hand, and indeed, and forgive me for being very political sciencey here, that democracy is incentive compatible with the interests of the autocratic regime. Now, this is a big book. This is a big book. It's a book, it's bigger than any book I've ever written. It's got 10 chapters, 12 case studies. It really is a journey through the entire Asia region. And as with any big book, and when you have two authors who think they know a lot about a region, you have to make choices, right? And as I tell all my doctoral students, the hardest part about writing your dissertation isn't actually putting the words on the page, it's deciding what not to include. And so Dan and I spent a lot of time as co-authors debating about the kinds of authorial choices that we wanted to make. I'm going to, and I won't go through all of them, but I do want to highlight two that I think are quite important to the story that I want to tell. The first is that we chose to feature Japan as the first case study. Now, Japan is actually not the best case study. The paradigmatic example of democracy through strength, as I've already described to you, actually is Taiwan. And that is the subsequent chapter describing Taiwan as the exemplar of democracy through strength. But we chose to do Japan because in many ways it was the most counterintuitive example. The conventional wisdom around democracy and democratization in post-war Japan is that it is in many ways the consummate case of democracy through weakness. After all, this is a country and a regime that had suffered defeat at the end of World War II. The conventional wisdom sees that democracy was externally imposed by the American occupation. And in our analysis, we concede all of these things. Of course, this is historical empirical fact. The American occupation had an extraordinary influence in how Japan politically developed. The end of the war and the war itself had an extraordinary influence on the kind of political economy that we would see emerge from World War II. But we also make the argument that there were in fact political conservatives and political parties that had emerged during the Taisho period of democracy of the 1920s and 30s that had in many ways survived World War II and became the institutional basis upon which democracy was grafted thereafter. When the US occupation leadership first asked the Japanese interim government in 1945 to draft a constitution, the constitution that they drafted was basically a copy of the authoritarian Meiji Constitution. These were not Democrats. When given the choice to craft their own future democratic constitution, they hewed to the historical autocratic constitution that had gotten them into the mess that they were in the first place. It was only then that the Americans drafted the Constitution in 1946, which was, of course, later adopted by the Japanese democracy. But the point that we make in the book is that over time, democracy became incentive compatible to these conservatives. The reverse course of 1947, which was a reverse course in American foreign policy in the region, saw, for instance, the American political forces and American military forces at the time starting to clamp down on the left. This was good for the conservatives in Japan. Beginning in 1948, the American occupation began to allow the reformation of the industrial combines. This was good for the conservatives in Japan. In other words, democracy proved to be incentive compatible for the conservatives in Japan, and indeed by 1955 had consolidated into what is now known as the Liberal Democratic Party, or the LDP, which then subsequently ruled Japan for nearly 4 decades. Democracy worked for these former autocrats. And there's no denying that Japan has been a robust democracy ever since. The second choice we made is around China. We had originally drafted one chapter on China, and we had presented papers at various APSA conferences on democracy avoidance in China. We were essentially trying to explain why China had rejected democracy in 1989 in the wake of the Tiananmen Square crackdown and/or massacre, and why it continues to resist democracy today. It was originally intended to be one chapter. It was a really long chapter, and so we decided maybe we should write 2 chapters. But actually something else emerged. We began to think, the reason why the Chinese Communist Party in 1989 resisted democracy, it was not because this was an autocratic regime, but rather it was a regime that was too weak to concede. We often now think of the Chinese Communist Party as this omnipresent and omnipotent political party, but if you think back to 1989, it was really half a generation removed from the Cultural Revolution. This was an economy that was predating the 1992 Southern Tour and the 1993 economic reforms where China's economy really takes off. In other words, in 1989, the CCP was a weak party presiding over a relatively weak economy. And so with the benefit of hindsight now, when we look back and we look at the historical data and we look at the archives and we look at the records, particularly party records at the time, indeed there is strong evidence to suggest that the party chose not to concede democracy because it simply lacked the strength to do so. We finished the book, however, by contemplating China today. And the argument that we make, of course, is that China today and the Chinese Communist Party is a prime candidate for a democracy through strength scenario. If the Chinese Communist Party were to convene founding elections right now, there is no way that the CCP would lose those elections. Although if we wait 6 more months, it might be a different situation. What I've shared with you are some analytical narratives that really make up the book. And if you're interested in having a deep understanding of the political, economic, and social transformations of the region, you can read the book for those analytical narratives. But there is a theory that drives this book. And it's a theory that, in many ways, as Sanjay has noted, speaks directly to the conventional wisdom in what we call in political science transitology theory. It is an industry, an invariable industry of scholarship within political science, trying to explain when and why regimes democratize. The conventional wisdom, as intimated already by Sanjay and as I've argued, the conventional wisdom suggests that democracies emerge through weakness. And you can see that here on the left-hand column of this slide. What are the characteristics of a democracy through weakness scenario? It's one, for instance, in which the autocratic regime collapses. It collapses under the weight of its own illegitimacy, like the Philippines. These regimes turn to democracy only as a last resort. It's an act of desperation. Oftentimes, it involves a series of negotiations for the outgoing autocratic leader so that he and his followers don't end up in jail or, worse yet, dead. Under these scenarios, these autocratic regimes are not just conceding democracy. They are, by design, conceding defeat. They oftentimes negotiate their exit. They anticipate their future obsolescence. And as Acemoglu and Robinson, who have penned arguably the most influential book of the 21st century around democratization, regimes concede democracy and weak regimes concede democracy due to the threat of revolution. They're only going to give up power when the threat of revolution becomes so overpowering that they feel they have no other choice. That's the conventional wisdom, democracy through weakness. Our theory of democracy through strength is in many ways the exact opposite of this. These are not regimes that are on the verge of collapse. These are not weak regimes, but rather these are strong regimes presiding over strong economies. These are regimes that have tremendous amounts of credibility. In many instances, they're actually quite popular. It's inconceivable that without their leadership that the economy would continue to be stable. In a democracy through strength scenario, we see autocratic regimes preemptively choosing a democratic pathway, not when they're weak, not when they're about to be ousted, not on the verge of collapse. They preemptively choose democracy precisely when they're strong. And indeed, as we argue, they unleash a series of reversible experiments, as we saw, for instance, in Myanmar. Reversible is critical because when things don't go well, you can always clamp down again. And you can revert back to authoritarianism. But what is absolutely critical is that whereas in a democracy through weakness scenario, it's the threat of revolution that compels a regime to democratize. In our scenario, it's the expectation of stability, that the incumbent expects that with democratic transition, the political order remains stable, the economy remains stable, and society remains stable. And this is in many ways very counterintuitive to how we oftentimes think of democratization. And again, I point to all of the popular writing out there now looking for the seeds of the CCP's collapse in China as the harbinger of democracy to come, as though that's the only possible pathway. And the argument we're making here is that it is indeed not the only pathway. In other words, the expectation of stability on the part of these autocratic regimes means that they're confident regimes. Regimes that lack confidence are the ones that we should be scared about. Confident regimes are ones that believe that through their record of economic development, they have a sufficient track record, a credible track record, what Anna G.B. refers to as a usable past, something that they can draw on to appeal to voters to say, look, we were an autocratic regime for decades, but we delivered 10% growth for every year for 3 decades. We are now going to become a democratic regime. You should vote for us. In other words, it's a regime and it's a political party that is confident that it would win, and we call this victory confidence. The ability of these autocratic regimes over time as well to reduce poverty and to foster and facilitate economic development also gives them stability confidence. And it's the combination of victory confidence, i.e., if we were to have free and fair democratic elections, we'd win, and the combination of that with stability confidence, i.e., if we were to have democratic elections, we would win, and society, the economy, and the polity would remain stable, is precisely the duo confidence that's required for this type of scenario to emerge. Now, I want to be very clear that strength and confidence alone does not predict stable democratic transitions. China is a terrific case in point. You have a very strong regime, and you have, by most measures, or until recently, a very confident regime. So the fact of strength and confidence alone do not predict a stable democratic transition. Ultimately, it's a choice. Jiang Jingguo, who was the autocrat in Taiwan, chose in 1986 not to repress the opposition political party and to lift martial law. No Tae-woo in the summer of 1987 chose not to repress the protesters in Seoul, but rather to concede democratic transition. They ultimately chose a democratic pathway and a democracy through strength scenario because they had received signals that notwithstanding the accumulation of historical strengths, or what we call antecedent strengths, they were nonetheless past the apex of their political power. And this is really critical. And these signals can be a variety of signals. They could be economic signals. The economy starts to slow. It's not that the economy is tanked, but it's starting to slow. It could be an electoral signal. Authoritarian regimes have elections as well. It's just that the one party wins every time and there may not be another political party. But electoral signals also demonstrate waning popularity, contentious politics, protest, particularly mass mobilization, is another example of a kind of signal, or geopolitical signals, losing, for instance, a superpower patron, as both Taiwan and South Korea did in the 1980s. These are all signals that the otherwise still very strong autocratic regime had passed their apex of power. And it's by reading those signals that in some instances, autocrats will choose to change their strategy, and they will choose to concede democracy. And the book, all nearly 400 pages, has lots of evidence bearing this out in terms of how regimes read these signals, interpreted them, and changed their strategy moving forward. That being said, there are also lots of regimes that read the signals incorrectly, don't see the signals, or ignore them. And when that happens, the autocratic regime has no choice but to hang on to political power through autocratic means, and oftentimes that leads to disastrous outcomes over the long term. As I've noted several times, it's a big book. It's one that took us 10 years to write. A lot of analytical description is invested in the book. But I wanted to just distill some key conclusions from the book, and conclusions that are particularly relevant, I want to argue, to today's situation. The first conclusion that I think is one that I want to stress is that developmental Asia, as we describe it, the 12 cases that we describe, is not uniquely ill-suited for democratization, as many cultural essentialists will argue, as though Asians are somehow incapable of practicing democracy. But rather, in fact, what we've described as a region that is distinctly well-suited for democracy through strength. That precisely because, as I noted at the very beginning of this talk, this is a region that has become transformed. It is a developmental success. It's a miracle. And indeed, it sets the stage for what we argue as being a well-suited set of conditions for democracy through strength. The second conclusion that I want to draw is that developmental records and the long history of economic and social development and the structural transformations that come with it set the stage for what is potentially either a stabilizing democratic transition or a destabilizing one. Development is critical. We don't want to deny that. Right? There is a reason why developmental successes are more likely to become democratic successes. What we argue in this book, however, is a certain political sequence that leads to these particular outcomes. The third conclusion that I want to stress here, and it is really important, and that is that conceding democracy is not tantamount to conceding defeat. In fact, the opposite. Oftentimes, the way in which we conventionally think of democratic transition is that by conceding democracy, you're necessarily conceding your political obsolescence. You're necessarily conceding your defeat. What we argue in this book, in fact, is that by conceding democracy from a position of strength, you're not at all conceding defeat, and in fact, you are likely to retain political power. And you're likely to retain political power as a democratic party, and one in which we see continued stability. Which then leads to the last point that I want to stress, and that is that demonizing and marginalizing authoritarian regimes is not likely to instigate democratic transition, or at least stable democratic transition. Rather, democracy promotion ought to focus on the compatibility of democracy and development. That authoritarian regimes that have predicated their hold on power on their ability to deliver development can continue to deliver development even under democratic conditions, evidenced by the cases that we describe in the book. In closing, I just want to say, I hope this book and this talk has been somewhat provocative for you, but I want to backstop that by saying that the stakes of the conversation cannot be overstated at this time. Not just in terms of these autocracies themselves and the people living within these autocracies, and indeed those who are living in fragile democracies, but that the implications and the stakes are also global in scope. And so I hope this talk and this book is a way of imploring the global community to recognize alternative pathways to democratic transition and democratic futures, that collapsism, as we call it, is not the only way in which democracy can emerge. And I also hope that the autocrats out there who might see this as a playbook for their own political survival over the longer term is to implore autocrats that development and democracy are not just possible, but indeed they're incentive compatible, that they're mutually reinforcing, not just theoretically, but as we've demonstrated this in this book, empirically the case as well. Thank you very much.
So, as you said, confidence is a key term in your book. You said there's two types of confidence that ruling elites who are successful at democratizing have. They have confidence that they're going to be victorious in this new regime. Can't be certain. Democracy, as you talk about, as scholars of democracy always say, is institutionalized uncertainty. But they have good reasons through all these signals that they're going to fare well in this new regime, and they're confident that the economy, the polity, society generally is going to be relatively stable. It's not going to be chaotic. So that's a really important argument. And one of the things that's very striking, and you didn't have time to go through it, there's four clusters of countries in this set of 12 that Joe and Dan study. So there's the developmental cluster, South Korea, Taiwan, Japan was first, the military regimes, Indonesia, Myanmar, Thailand, the so-called, well, not so-called, the former colonies of Britain, Hong Kong, Singapore, Malaysia, and then the socialist regimes. And one of the arguments you make in the book, so this would be the first sort of thing to talk about, is, and I think there's a really productive tension here. I think all good books have productive tensions. So I think this is the first productive tension in this book, is that on the one hand, it really matters what choices leaders make. They have to interpret signals, right? They have to read the room of politics, right? They can sort of see which way history is starting to move. Are they at the apex of their power? Are they in decline? At the same time, in the book, you really stress, and you did it in the conclusion now too, that these regimes are going to be more confident the stronger they are, and the stronger they are depends on their model of development. So Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, really strong regimes, because at a certain model of development, which scholars call these developmental states, the bureaucracy is powerful, the ruling party is powerful, the coalition supporting the ruling party is powerful. So the first question is, how do you balance this? How do you balance what I think of as a tension, that on the one hand, the regimes that are most likely to become stable democracies are really strong, institutionally very strong autocratic regimes. And on the other hand, there's an emphasis in the book that, look, choices matter, strategy matters, you can make the right decision, you can make the wrong decision. So what role does political judgment have amongst these leaders when they're, and how, because this, as we know, we all do in our own lives. In retrospect, things look clear.
Yeah. But
prospectively, as all politicians, as all human beings have to do, make decisions facing uncertainty. How do you balance that in your argument in the book?
So as I say, the exemplary case is the case of Taiwan, where it was, this was a regime that had every reason to be the most confident in terms of being victorious as well as stability confidence. And as you get into some of the deeper layers of the book, we talk about a sort of spectrum of strength and so on. So So antecedent strength and confidence are quite variable as well. So I'll give you an example of South Korea, right? So in the summer of 1987, we see hundreds of thousands of people protesting in the streets, and we have this incumbent regime under Chun Doo-hwan at the time, and he hands over power to No Tae-woo in the summer of '87. And No Tae-woo says, geez, you know, these protests, it really looks like we may be past our apex of power here. We might want to make a preemptive decision to democratize because we have just enough strength to concede and be victorious. But they, at the time, and this is, you know, without getting too much into the weeds, they made one bet. And their bet was that Kim Yong-sam and Kim Dae-jung, who were the two opposition leaders at the time, would split the opposition vote. And we have evidence now, and we've done the interviews with elites from the time, where they really contemplated this, right? And you can see the deep kind of strategic thinking that went into this. What is the likelihood of Kim Dae-jung and Kim Yong-sam splitting the vote? They, in the end, decided it was highly likely, and that's exactly what happened, right? So political mistakes can be made all the time. I mean, this is, you know, as you say, democracy, as Adam Jaworski notes, is about institutionalized uncertainty. There's no way that there are any guarantees. And so these kinds of political strategic decisions have to be made all the time. Now, to give you another example, when I talk to colleagues and friends in China, and you know, we're actually allowed to make these arguments in China, right? Which is actually kind of interesting because it's an argument about democratization in China that doesn't criticize the regime. It's an argument that actually says, you know, this regime has been remarkably successful, a little inhuman when it comes to the way in which it treats citizens, but you might want to consider a democracy through strength scenario because this is precisely the time in which you want to do it. And it's interesting when I talk to some colleagues in China, they'll say, I buy the argument completely, right? It makes total sense. This is something the party should consider. But can we wait until my son graduates from Harvard? Right, and then we'll do it, right? So these are, again, human, and this is why I wanted to stress, is that there are these transformative forces that have been going on and that have, you know, completely transformed these political societies, but in the end, it's human beings that have to make these choices. And they can hedge, they can be conservative, they can be anxious, they can gamble as they did in South Korea, or they can, as, you know, my friend says to me, this is terrific, just not now, right? Because there are some risks. So that's politics, that's reality, and that's why, again, you know, as with any social science theory, you want to say that it has some predictive power, but any theory that's too overly deterministic isn't really a theory anymore. It's probably spurious, right? So we talk about the likelihood of a stable democratic transition given these kinds of political judgments, but there are no guarantees.
So a second question would be, the book stresses the importance, and this links up with other scholarship that's path-breaking scholarships come out, and this book joins that path-breaking scholarship for the last, you know, decade, where, you know, as we've been saying, that when we think of the history of democracy, particularly in what's called the third wave since the 1970s, we focus on, rightly, the role of students and workers and mass social movements that are fighting against authoritarian regimes, against traditional elites that want to hang on to power. But of course, when you look far back historically, so early 19th century Europe, through the 19th century, conservative forces, conservative social forces are actually very important in the transition to democracy. Yep. And one of the questions that comes up is, how large a price do progressives and Democrats and radicals and these movements, how large a price do they pay in striking bargains with conservative forces? So the argument would be, conservatives see good reasons, especially if they think the power is starting to decline, to make a deal. We're going to make a transition to democracy, but in doing so, often authoritarian regimes, just Latin America is I think, exemplary case, the region, 1970s, 80s, we're going to get all kinds of institutional guarantees that protect our social and economic interests, either for our groups, right? So we're going to make sure that certain soldiers and generals can be prosecuted for human rights violations. We're going to make sure that the army might have certain conclaves in the economy that can protect, so on and so forth. We can't have massive redistribution of property rights and so on. So there are these kinds of bargains that get struck, And one of the criticisms that arises then is that, okay, you have a transition to democracy, but so many things are taken off the table that what kind of democracy do we have? And this argument, I think, in Latin America was quite strong and continues to be, and I think helps explain the waves and reverse waves you've seen, the pink tide of the 1990s, the reverse, and now you see what's happening in Brazil just in the last week. Very contentious, polarized. How does that play out in Asia you study?
So that's a great question. I mean, so two ways in which I'd answer it. The first is that in the talk, I focus really on the decisions that political elites make. In the book, there's a much deeper exposition of the social forces at play here in terms of the social movements, in terms of the mass mobilization that occurs. After all, these are important signals, right? And so we would be analytically disingenuous not to really give that the full treatment. So that's absolutely critical, and democratic activists are, a key actor in the story. But what you've described in terms of the Latin American experience is the crafting in of what Latin Americanists refer to as authoritarian enclaves, right? Sort of these little reservations of autocratic power, or little enclaves of extrajudicial power and so forth, that when things go badly, that they can reverse democracy. And that's symptomatic, actually, of less strong regimes, right? You build in those authoritarian enclaves when you're not that confident that you can win with free and fair elections. And so what we see, the most successful and most stable democratic transitions in the region are ones in which, now that being granted, even in the case of Taiwan, we have the ruling autocratic party turned democratic party crafting a set of electoral rules that give them a massive seat bonus in rural districts, right? But that's happening all over the place, and we're seeing that happen in the U.S. and so on. So, these are rules that in many ways advantage the incumbent party, but they're very confident that even in the absence of these authoritarian enclaves, that they can be quite successful. So relative, comparative strength is really important here, not comparative or relative to the opposition, but you have very strong regimes like the KMT in Taiwan. You have less strong regimes like the military leadership in South Korea. You have even less strong regimes under Suharto and Golkar in Indonesia. They all adhere to a logic of democracy through strength, but to varying degrees. And in varying ways, they are building in these kinds of authoritarian enclaves. But, that's a function, and it's something that reflects precisely the theory that we argue, that the stronger the regime, the more likely it is to choose a real democracy through strength scenario.
And as you opened your lecture, you talked about the fact that in 2000 there was a momentous election in Taiwan that, was hard to imagine a dozen years before that.
And it's really incredible because I was, in 2000, I was like 27 years old. I didn't even really appreciate what was going on here, right? And it wasn't until, my doctoral advisor who had been blacklisted on both the mainland and in Taiwan for his pro-democracy work, that I really got a sense of just, how momentous this was, that the same autocratic security apparatus was now protecting this democratically elected opposition activist, and also just how analytically significant that was. Like, that's just crazy, right? So the moment was one that was always stayed in my mind, but analytically it was one that really took another 10 years of thinking about it, that we began to start piecing together a theory of why this was A, remarkable, and B, theoretically feasible.
I just want to ask one more question, and we're going to open it up, although there's lots, as you can see on this piece of paper here. And what would be the question to ask?
An easy one would be good.
There's one I definitely want to get to, which is your conclusion, but I'm hoping some of the audience might pick up on this, which is the really, I think, very provocative, important question of how should we, living in democracies, address autocratic regimes? And China is the most important, but there are others too. The question I wanted to ask, though, is I think the most counterintuitive, surprising finding in the book for me, I work on India most of the time, and so it is one of these regimes. It is a former British colony. And the book the book shows this remarkable finding that the three you look at, so these are, of course, city-states, Hong Kong, Singapore, Hong Kong now, of course, under Chinese sovereignty, but Hong Kong, Singapore, Malaysia actually resist democratic reforms to a greater extent than military regimes that ruled Indonesia, which actually is one of the most remarkable democracies in the world now in the last 15, 20 years.
Yeah.
Thailand, which has suffered 2 old-fashioned coups in the last 2 decades, and Myanmar, which is in a very regressive state right now because of everything we read about. So just think about that for a moment, that the former British colonies are more resistant to democratic reform in these cases in Asia than former military regimes, despite the fact that their economies have transformed much more remarkably. They have a stronger commitment to the rule of law, the courts are strong, and the Westminster system of parliamentary government, like we have in Canada, and the first past post electoral system, like we have in Canada, actually gives the ruling parties a massive advantage if they were to contest the vote, because they'd only need 35, 40% of the vote to win 60, 70% of the seats, as we see in our own democracy. So why is that? That is such a counterintuitive finding.
Yeah, it's a great question. And as you've intimated, so the book has 12 cases, and we divide the cases into these developmental clusters. So developmental statism, militarism, and what you've just described in terms of developmental Britannia. And the argument, or the reason why we cluster them is, in one sense, it's intended to help us analytically group the cases, right? And so there's a descriptive element that all of these cases share some similarities, but that also the style of political economic development in each of them is distinct and has a distinct causal relationship with democratic prospects. And one of the things that stands out with the developmental Britannia cases, Hong Kong, Singapore, and Singapore is a great example, actually, because Hong Kong obviously has other sovereignty challenges that are now impossible to overcome, is that, in fact, the rule of law and the formal legal institutions that were in many ways bequeathed by British colonialism have created a set of institutions that actually provide, in many ways, the benefits of what we see in a strong institutional democracy, such as the rule of law, the impartiality of the judiciary, and so forth, and therefore deliver the benefits without actually democratizing. And so, from the point of view of the autocratic ruler now, they can point to a regime that has the institutions that in many ways mimic the legalistic framework of a democracy without ever having actually to concede full democratic elections. So it's a question of incentives in that case, and a question of institutions that frankly predate all of these regimes, right? So I agree with you. It's, when you think about Singapore, and when we talk to colleagues in Singapore all the time, it's like, if you just leveled the playing field, the PAP is going to win. Like, seriously, right? But they're just like, what do we need to level the playing field for? We're already, we have strong rule of law. We have really good legal institutions here. We have all of the institutional benefits of democracy without actually having democracy. And that becomes a real break, and it becomes a disincentive as opposed to an incentive for an autocratic ruler to choose democracy. The militarist regimes have the complete opposite. They need that democratic concession in order to re-legitimate their regimes, in order to refurbish their institutions in a way that, they can only hope mimics what we see in developmental Britannia.
I can only see how this argument is going to play out in the British House of Lords when it happens.